Okay.
I wanted to mention before that, and related to Richard's paper, which he had presented at the Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies, it's the Jilson lecture. So very prestigious, as you can tell. So we were very happy to be able to have it here and to have it taken. And related to that, one of the activities with which this Aquinas Leadership International Group is involved is with the Catholic University of Lublin annual Congress on Man and Culture that happens in June, and in connection with the International Atheist Gilson Society, which co-sponsors that. And I have forms for membership in the International Atheist Gilson Society, in case any of you are interested in it. We published the Studio Gilsoniana, and in fact, papers from this Congress get. In fact, there's a copy here of the Studio Gilsoniana that you might have seen. And Father Paul is the general editor, our friend Father Powell. Next year, the École Pratique in, I think, November is going to have a 150th anniversary celebration of its founding, and the Gilson is going to be a special events related to Gilson. So anybody that is interested in that, we can give you information about that. And we're going to have some special events related to Gilson also in Poland, probably in Warsaw, as well as in Lublin, and maybe up around Turin. So that would be in June, before next year's Congress, which would be around July. So we're not simply involved in this Congress here at Huntington, but we're also involved internationally in other congresses. So just to let you know, but you really have to get the information through the International Atheist Gilson Society about those things.
You're not in the safe room on the Titanic.
No.
Yeah. Actually, let me talk a bit.
Sure.
Let me look at this. Let me put on my Protestant hat. Okay? How does a Protestant look at what's going on? I'm just working through a book right now. I'm glad that I decided to straighten this Protestant. There's a theological historian out of Cambridge, Dyer is his name, has written a book called Protestant, How It Changed the Face of Western Society. Now, in that, he carefully doesn't say Protestantism, because he thinks there is no such thing as a Protestantism. There are Protestants with different leaders and different congregations. Okay? And as he looks at it, he picks three leaders that he thinks shaped the face of the Protestant and the Protestant movement, and is shaping the face of the Protestant movement now. One is Martin Luther. The other, I forget their name, but it's total unknowns, but it's a slave, who was a slave in one of the Dutch colonies, and she became a Jehovah's Witness. Okay, very, very powerful at that time. And she earned her freedom, and she went to Holland, and she started this massive movement. She became sort of a Protestant mystic in Europe. The other was in Germany, where during the Nazi regime, there were actually clergy and I think leading theologians who were strongly supporting church and state, supporting the Nazi party. Okay, they thought the nationalism would be good. So really, what you have in the Protestant movement are three types of Protestants. You've got the Martin Luther type, which is really St. Augustine. You know, there's the world, the city of God, and the city of man, and the world is. No, this would not shock them. Why would you get upset about? Because we are of the kingdom of God. The other would be the Jehovah's Witness type Protestant movement. That they really don't get that excited about this, because they're really out there working with the poor and the needy, and then you got the third extreme, that the Jerry Falwell, that movement, that America is a Christian Protestant. America and Christianity are one and the same type of thing. That's that third Protestant. The reason I bring it up is the movement that is most successful today and growing like crazy, in America even, in Latin America, in China even, is the Protestant, the Luther type thing with a little bit of the feel for the needy and the poor and so forth. But it's that Luther type, look, this world has all this stuff, okay? And so it's the churches that are growing, and the word Dyer uses the churches that are clearly and emphatically apolitical. Now, the political thing is dangerous because, for example, even in North Korea, we have a Presbyterian church, supported, by the government there because it keeps the masses, patriotic. But in the apolitical churches, they avoid all this political rhetoric, especially in Latin America. The missionaries come, the communists come in, everybody comes.
The Benedict option seems like a pretty apolitical movement.
Okay.
Right?
But then in Protestantism, remember now, what makes this Protestant movement move isn't so much the mysticism. There is a type of mysticism growing there too. But it's, I have personally accepted Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. And to the extent that I have the awareness of that, no matter what happens around me, okay?
Yeah.
But then I also have, the only thing I should be concerned about right now, in my apologetics, is to sit in tears and fear for other people who haven't accepted Jesus Christ as of yet. That's, forget everything you're talking about.
Yeah.
That's what God will call me accountable for, if anything. And at the same time, I live in a congregation that is a congregation of healing, of empowerment, and of miracles. Miracles, and that's in various forms. From the preacher who says, if you accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior and so forth, He will give you everything material you need to survive. To those that don't go that route, okay? For example, Joe Osteen, 50,000 parishioners, except every year gives about $20 million to hospitals in Africa and so forth. My wife goes to a church like that, which is of that theology, and that 20,000 members, of which 15% of the members are ex-Roman Catholics, who go there, who find in this world that we're in, the acceptance of this personal Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, and the experience of coming to that. I had a church in Sedalia, and we also had a Mexican Pentecostal service, okay? And I never used to go to it very seldom. The service went for about 3 hours, okay? But what was most interesting about that service was when the lay preachers gave testimony as to why they had come to Jesus Christ. I wasn't a good father, I wasn't this. I'll come back to it. It seems to me that means in a massive way, in an evangelical way, kind of to the Benedict option, and a little bit of the Guardini too, the mystical experience.
Yeah, good, thanks. I guess what I mean by experience of God is not emotional, even psychological experience. It's deeper than that. If you read works like The Cloud of Unknowing, and if you read writings about centering prayer and the prayer of quiet, for instance, Teresa of Avila. Yeah. The experience of God is more like an unknowing of everything else. It's more like a kind of emptying and an experience of nothing. And it's a very subtle, I don't have much personal experience of this, but when you read these saints and mystics, it's not the same as the sort of over-emotional recognition of a kind of juridical relationship. Now you're saved. So that's not a mystical experience. And I guess this recognition that I have accepted Jesus, it's different than what we're talking about. I guess you could construe what I'm saying as a kind of like subjectivism, like a Kierkegaardian kind of understanding of Christianity. But no, I read Guardini, and it occurred to me that Guardini has something really serious to teach us about. I think he had a prophetic insight about some future state. He wasn't describing the 1950s, I'll tell you that. And it's amazing what he says. And then I started reading Rahner on this. And, this book here, The Practice of Faith, the Handbook of Contemporary Spirituality, he's got a section on, the Christians of the future, what they will be like. And, listen to this. So this sounds like Guardini. The spirituality of the future will not be supported, it will be much less supported by a sociologically Christian homogeneity of its situation. It will have to live much more clearly than hitherto out of a solitary, immediate experience of God and His Spirit in the individual. And he talks about how formerly this act of faith on the part of the individual took place within a homogeneously Christian milieu, even though of a secular bourgeois society. It was possible to believe what was believed by more or less everyone, at least in the public sphere and verbal communication. It almost seemed as if a person was relieved, particularly in the dimension of faith, from the supposed untransferable burden of responsibility, of the decision of faith against unbelief, of hope against all hope, of unrewarded love. Today it's different. Christian faith today must be continually freshly realized. And he says, in this situation, the lonely responsibility of the individual in his or her decision of faith is necessary and required in a way much more radical than it was in former times. The lonely responsibility of the individual in his or her decision of faith. So what I said in my talk about how the Benedict option communities might stunt your growth, if you're in a community, I've been in these communities, like-minded, fellow Catholics with similar education, similar understanding of the world, similar worldviews, a similar sense of the possible infections out there and dangers, kind of almost a Pharisee-like fear of contamination. And there becomes a sense that if you're part of your tribe, and the more a true believer you are in your little tribe, the more faith you have. And there could be a tendency to lose this perspective that this isn't going to save you here, this little community. And just because the certain consciousness and self-identity of this community, I call it a self-justifying community, you know what I mean? Just because you have this conceit about yourselves, it doesn't mean it's true. You're very conveniently not letting in the other to kind of contrast with you. Where's Socrates in this community? Is he there? And it's a dangerous thing. You can see the danger of Benedict community. And by the way, I'm still saying that we need to do it. We still need to get together.
It's the danger that becomes a Catholic safe space.
Yes.
And snowflakes.
Yes.
But what you just read there, I'm glad Joe came back, because I think in Protestantism, the way they would respond to the modern world is more on the line of C.S. Lewis. Now, C.S. Lewis, by the way, never became a high church Anglican. He was always very much low church in his theology, okay? And he still was somewhat of a sola scriptura guy. So the conversion comes, and it isn't a mystical expression, and of course Protestants, for the greater part, would be very suspicious of talking about mysticism.
Yeah.
That's a Catholic thing, and it's a spooky thing to them when they get nervous, okay? That's not the word. They have heard that been called by Jesus to the word through a slow, steady process, but the important thing for them is, in their worship, they are sharing with other people. You can't understand Protestant evangelical worship unless you understand this, that they are sharing with other people who have made the same personal acceptance of Jesus Christ and Lord and Savior.
Yeah.
And for example, Joel Osteen isn't evangelical, but if you go, people watch him on TV, but if you go to one of his rallies or services and you sit in the congregation, which I've done, you're sitting beside people from poor black churches to the wealthy person from the country club and so forth. It's amazing. There's 10,000 people there, all different classes, races and stuff disappears in that worship session. It's that sense of, and it's this fantastic experience of the power of the body of Jesus Christ, where it's not, Protestants would see what you just read, and they'd have a hard time understanding it because they see the guy going off into the corner all by himself. And where do I share my experience of the risen Christ in worship? And that's what's growing.
I wonder what Guardini means that loneliness and faith would be terrible, and the one lonely person to another sharing love, right? And what do you think about that?
Yeah, but if I can, I studied under Father Pacwa, you know him?
Yeah.
I was in a master's in theology program. University of Dallas. He made a statement one time that I've always remembered. He said, in the darkest of times will emerge some of our greatest saints. And, if you look at the Reformation time, there were this huge catastrophic schism and 900 people, schisms from the church, and we had wars and killings and all kinds of propaganda and all this kind of stuff, right? Well, when you talk about some of your mystical basis, and Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, Francis de Sales, some of the really great saints which have kind of put down what their spirituality experience was. They came all in that same period, right after the Reformation, these dark times.
Yeah.
And so I think we're entering another time like that.
Yeah.
And I think that, when you talk about, the loneliness, I mean, actually, you remember Mother Teresa, she talked about how lonely she felt, how far from God she felt, yet she was the holiest woman that just exuded grace in her words and, the insights and all these things. She didn't feel close to God.
But she had the experience of union with God. God wasn't giving her the translation of that experience to her emotions and psychological faculties.
Right.
But she was aware of it at such a deep level that it enabled her to be a saint. That's the experience we're talking about.
And that's very much a painful experience. You go through a purgation and a cleansing, and God takes over your movements, your ideas.
And Thomas talks about this in his commentary on Aristotle's metaphysics, so the end. Talking about the relation of happiness and metaphysics, and the extent to which people who are metaphysically oriented, more or less moving into that kind of a situation, increasingly, can't talk to anybody. To get assistance in what they're doing because nobody else is working, in this area. So so it is. You get the feeling of loneliness because you basically are trying to solve a problem, and you can't communicate with anybody else about what you're doing because the expertise required to do it. It's so limited.
And there's a lot of things just on a mystical basis going on, and some of these people are called to really the depths of spirituality. And one thing I remember, another wise guy who was my director of the program, was my best friend actually from high school, we football together. He said, John, for this way, you're going to need a lot of grace. And you need it. What is holy? What is the way of holiness? You need to find everywhere you can get access to grace. You need to find it. Prayer, sacraments, these things, because you can't do this alone. When you talk about this loneliness and this, feeling of, what are we up against and all this, you can't do it from your own human strength. So you have to go wherever you're going to get the grace.
Do you think the working class can understand that?
Yeah. I mean, I know all kinds of people. I mean, have you ever heard like these third orders, Dominican third order groups and Franciscan third order, especially Dominican because they're Thomistic.
That's the working
There
class.
are kinds of people, you can explain this in all kinds of different ways, but it takes, it's not something you're going to learn overnight. You gradually are introduced to it.
Frank Sheen had to go to the parks in Hyde Park and stand on a box and scream out to the working class to get their attention.
So here's the other thing, something that you said. You said, the fastest growing is the Lutheran kind. And maybe that's true, but actually the fastest growing is the Pentecostal.
Well, that's part of the model.
That's the Pentecostal experience is creating more Christians. I'm not saying necessarily on a deep level of spirituality, but that's kind of what I experienced in the charismatic movement. It's kind of where I was caught. And it's originally sort of a surfacey thing, but some people are deeper.
More depth of spirituality than working class.
Yeah.
But not mysticism. I don't think, not mysticism.
Well, you
He's
can have
talking
mystics
about-
who are not
No,
intellectuals, you know.
It's personal conversion, common sense conversion.
I think that the firefighters and the police department, members of the police department running up to the World Trade Center, 90% of them who were probably, in all likelihood, Catholics.
But they're not mystics.
And that takes a mystical kind of.
But they're not mystics at all.
Mysticism is a graded scale. You know what I mean? You never really arrive until you're in heaven, you know? But it's a graded scale.
Well, what Ronner's phrase is everyday mysticism. And he's got some really striking text on this. He says things like this, when you recognize that you're alone with God and that no one can really understand you, and you can't really understand everyone else, no matter how much you love them, and there's a certain kind of a tragic separation of everybody, and then you endure that, and then you don't accept substitutes to distract you from that, you're a mystic. When you have a sense of your conscience and you do what you're supposed to do, and you have no reason to do it other than this deep sense that you simply must, and everything's against you, and there's no rewards, and no one will reward you, and you still do it, and you do it consistently. These are people, he says, who may not even believe in God sometimes, or they don't have a kind of right orthodoxy about it, and they do it. And he gives this like list of different existential situations where someone is so in touch with the deep source of their being that they transcend the ego, they transcend all the blandishments of culture and society, and they just act in this kind of like holy righteous way, and they don't even know themselves why sometimes, but they just do, and it's because they're mystics. It's everyday mysticism. It's really cool. I really agree with Ronner on this. I think
Also,
there are
it's
people
because they
like
come to
that.
Jesus in a conversion experience.
Well, sometimes they have.
Yeah, authentic mysticism is,
It's practical.
it's from grace.
Well,
And people
grace.
can receive grace in all
Well,
kinds
that's
of different
what he's
ways,
saying, and
you know,
and
in
then-
ways we don't
And
understand.
you have two Catholics with the same architecture of their mind, same beliefs, same practices, and one of them, in those situations where no one's looking and no one's watching, they are practicing the presence of God, and they give a smile to someone who needs it instead of turning away, or these little subtle things, they're doing, the other person's not. That's the mystic, though, the one that's doing that, because the only reason they can be doing that is because they're in touch with God in a very deep way.
God is acting through them
Yeah,
in their
that's
faculties
everyday
beyond
mysticism.
just natural.
every
ways.
day.
I've seen this over in making numerous trips to Poland, and you see the Polish peasant class, for example, in the villages,
Yeah.
walking along, to churches, on Sundays, or you go into the village and there's nobody there, they're empty, and they're all in church.
Yeah.
It's absolutely amazing the depth of the spirituality. I've never seen it
Wow.
anywhere else, I'm sure, about Poland.
We have an ex-Pentecostal here. No, Anglican.
So Pentecostalism, I forget who said this, but has been referred to as neo-mysticism. The problem is that it is often a deracinated mysticism. And so they are sort of running blind, running into a lot of the same troubles that the tradition has already sort of steered through. And because they're cut off from that, they run into problems. But speaking from my own personal anecdotal experience, and even I think statistics, I mean, the average Pentecostal falls into that sort of working class mode. And my parents and grandparents fall into that. They have mystical experiences. They have visions and dreams. And my grandmother tells me stories of, I smelled this sort of perfume in the room, although, it was her bedroom, there was no perfume, and Jesus appeared to her, these sorts of things. Even when it comes to, just feeling the weight of the glory of God and crying in tears. I mean, this seems like mystical experiences to me. And I even think of C.S. Lewis. Which volume is it? He talks about he's traveling through heaven, right?
Great divorce.
Yes, in the Great Divorce. And there's this woman there, and there's, you know, angels all around, and they're singing around her, and there's all this glory. And he says, "Oh, this must be the Holy Mother." And and the guide says, "No, that's what was the name? Sue."
Just an ordinary.
Yeah, it's sort of like Jane Doe kind of a name. Someone that no one knew about, right? But she was faithful. You know, so she's just as holy as Mother Teresa and any other big name saint. But because she was never in the limelight, you know, no one knows her name in this world. In the next world, she has all the splendor, you know. And he's getting at ordinary saints, and I think that,
or ordinary mysticism.
Yeah.
See, I think you have this extraordinary mysticism with sights and sounds. That's certainly available, but the one I'm thinking about is much more subtle.
Mhm.
In fact, it doesn't have those things. It's a consciousness tweak. It's sort of like, it doesn't have all the externals and the sensual stuff and the psychological states.
It's a dark night of the senses, dark night.
Yeah, it's a dark night stuff,
That's
and
right.
it's a kind of way of unknowing, and it's a way of the way of the apophatic, you know. And yeah, but I guess they're complementary. But I guess I just wonder what you guys think about. Apologetics and the Benedict option and the situation we're in. I mean, I think we touched on this yesterday a little bit. Like, we talked about how these institutions are imploding the university, and we're going to have to be there to kind of teach everybody like these skills and habits that nobody's going to have anymore. You know, I mean, that seems a bit apocalyptic to me, the way that feels to me. You know?
Well,
I guess you got a question over there.
this is a good time to transition.
Let him ask a question.
Ask
Ask a question.
Oh, okay.
Let him ask a question.
Well, we're past time, right?
Let's transition.
All right. Sorry about that. Thank you for the discussion.
And Mark from the Center for Digital Life, Study of Digital Life, and talking about Romano Guardini, Pope Francis, and Technocratic. You can either transition back to the podium if you want. And that is, Kaczynski is going to be my respondent to Mark's presentation.
So we'll continue the conversation with a little more Guardini and the end. When I was 19 years old, I bought a used Porsche 356C and drove it nonstop from Madison, Wisconsin to Haight-Ashbury. And then we continued down the coast, and I guess I was quite fortunate to see Jim Morrison and the Doors perform "This Is the End, My Only Friend" at the Cheetah Club at Santa Monica Pier. So the end of the modern world, indeed. Thank you very much, Peter, for inviting me back. We had a lot of fun last year, and I'm learning an enormous amount this year. This has been very beneficial. Since last year, the center, which I had just then founded, has expanded, and we now have a group of about 25 fellows. Peter Berkman has joined us. He's one of those. And we have 5 projects currently in early stages. I wouldn't say any of them are advanced, but I was asked earlier if I'll be back next year, and I'm not sure, because I don't know, frankly, how deeply all these things will be developed. But 5 projects are located in Beijing, Tokyo, Moscow, Washington, D.C., and Rome. And what I'm going to describe to you in this presentation today is our Vatican project on Romano Guardini. It is our goal, with the help of some people at Notre Dame, as it turns out, the Notre Dame in South Bend, that one, Is Notre Dame still Catholic? Mike Jones, Notre Dame. With their help and some others, we're hoping to hold a conference in Rome next year. And Romano Guardini, and in fact, what I'm about to read to you, this is the first public presentation of something that we are hoping, in fact, to get a lot of attention. Can we have the slide, please? Thank you. I changed the title slightly, but it's the same subject. Yeah. So Thaddeus didn't go through this with you. We heard on behalf of many others that have been talked about here, we heard some things about their backgrounds. This is a view of Romano Guardini which would not be the normal way of presenting it. This is being presented this way specifically in relationship to this project. He turns out to have been right smack in the middle of some really serious problems. Peter and I went to a class that Peter Redpath would have enjoyed, given by a friend of Peter's, who's my pastor, Father John Perricone at the Latin Mass community at St. Anthony's in Jersey City. And Father Perricone gave a lecture on the spirit of liturgy, which was published in 1918. But Peter and I noted, when the questions came from the audience, why did he do this, what was going on, there really wasn't much of an answer. Well, we could pretty well know what was happening in 1918 in Germany. They just lost World War I. They were about to be I was about to say gang raped, but the Versailles Treaty was remarkably punishing. Not quite as bad as the plans after World War II to eliminate the war and make sure that Germany never produced another ingot of steel, which was the thought at that point, but it was pretty bad. Obviously, Lenin has just taken over in the October Revolution. But very importantly, Oswald Spengler has just published The Decline of the West. 2 volumes, 1917, 1918. And all this is happening in the context of the oath against modernism that Pius X had instituted in 1910, which I believe led to Heidegger leaving and what he thought was his vocation to become a Catholic theologian and leaving the church. This is really fraught time period. It turns out that in the midst of all of this, Guardini chose to not be a Thomist. He very deliberately chose to study Bonaventure instead. Now, there are many scholars here that know more about Bonaventure and Thomas than I do, but you can kind of imagine what that meant at that time under those circumstances, making that decision. He obviously avoided what Peter Redpath has, I think, correctly called first and second wave Thomism. I agree with Peter. We're now in the third wave, which is very, very important to this conference, and the other conferences Peter's doing are supporting something enormously beneficial, I believe. But he was also quite influenced by the Max Scheler phenomenology circle in Cologne. In particular, one of the members of that circle had published I suppose it could have been a German romantic reaction against technology. You can sort of imagine how that played out in those time periods. And this led to Romano Guardini to publish a series of letters between 1923 and 25, which were then collected and published in German in 27. Well, we know this as Letters from Lake Como. which isn't translated till English till 1984. So the English-speaking world didn't have the benefit of this. This is really the German world. But it turns out that Letters from Lake Como, which is the title by which we know this, isn't the title of the book. The subtitle, Explorations in Technology and the Human Race, is a little bit obscure, and what exactly is he talking about there? Well, it turns out this is the title of the book. This is the current German printing of Letters from Lake Como. Die Technik und der Mensch. That's a very different sense than letters from a beautiful lake, where, by the way, George Clooney has an estate, and where, by the way, David Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski started the Trilateral Commission in their Bellagio estate. So all kinds of, if you've ever been to Lake Como, it's absolutely remarkable, but that wasn't the point. So here we have Guardini putting an incredible stamp with all the rest that you might think about him, all the beautiful work, the Lord, Spirit of Liturgy, Death of Socrates, all this incredible work. That wasn't, I will argue, in Rome next year, if I get a chance, that wasn't what we should remember him for. We should remember him for being the only single, unique Catholic theologian who from a very early point was concentrated on the effects of technology on us. Not Karl Rahner. None of the rest of these people had anything useful to say about this, and we may get into a discussion about whether Heidegger had anything important to say about this. Sadie was talking about it before. So, but that's not the point, as it turns out. It gets worse or better, depending on how you want to look at this. He continues. So you think it was bad in Germany in 1918? What do you think it was like in Munich in 1947? Was there a Munich in 1947? It was rubble. Talk about despairing of despair. So in the midst of that remarkable destruction, Guardini gives lectures in 47, 48 at the University of Munich, which then becomes the end of the modern world. And very importantly, another series of lectures translated into English as Power and Responsibility. So this is a tracing of the background of Guardini, which you would never know if you went to the Guardini Foundation in Berlin, if you tried to talk to the Guardini chair, which I think has now been eliminated. So there's a lot of back and forth in Europe about Guardini, which we're hoping to intersect. Punchline is that in 1959, Romano Guardini gives a speech at the Technical University of Munich. How many people in the room here have been to Munich? How many of you, only a couple, how many of you, if you haven't been there, you know about the Deutsches Museum? Absolutely remarkable technology museum. My name is Stahlmann, originally with two N's. What does that mean? Man of Steel. What does Man of Steel mean? It turns out it's a 12th century name from a little village. People even know where this name came from. It means that those ancestors of mine, if they really are my ancestors, which I actually have some doubts, I'm Irish Catholic, and I think the Stallman I'm coming from was actually Irish, not German, but in any event, those early Stallmans made swords, magical alchemical swords, and you can go to that museum, the Deutsches Museum in Munich, and see how they did it. They got the kilns, they got the whole thing set up, quite remarkable. So here he is in this complete destruction, which then emerges, and Germany is being rebuilt, and guess what? What do you think all the engineering students in Munich in 1959 want to do? What do they want to be when they grow up? Build bridges? Not really. Villages were bombed out and they got rebuilt. They want to build computers. So Peter's done some research on the early design of computers in Germany, and turns out that Munich was a hotbed of computer design at the time that he gave this lecture. So what Peter and I are planning to do as an impetus towards this conference next year is to take the German, not this book, but the very last appended chapter, Die Maschine und der Mensch, which I firmly suspect, we'll get into Benedict and Francis here, I strongly suspect they've never read it, because they would have read their German Die Technik und der Mensch before it was added. They would have read an earlier German version. It's probably sitting on their shelves someplace. So there's a piece of Guardini that has never, you go on the internet, there's no reference to it. Nobody's ever had anything to say about it. So we have something to add, if you will, to Guardini scholarship. I just put on the end here to note for you, in the English language, there's very little useful on Guardini. There's one book out of Notre Dame. The man who wrote it is now the expert on Cardinal Casper. Everybody kind of knows what that means, I guess, in this room. Precursor to Vatican II is incorrect. That's not what Guardini actually was. And so this is an attempt, which is widespread in Guardini scholarship today, to claim him for something that he wasn't. As Father Perricone said at the end of the lecture on Monday, if you read the Spirit of Liturgy, you can't possibly believe that Guardini was pointing towards Novus Ordo. That was not what he thought we're going to head towards. Next slide, please. Boink. So what does this have to do? I mean, this is scholarship. This is all interesting. We're third wave Thomas. We're going to hold conferences, and we hope people will pay attention, and that the Holy Spirit will help all of us. Well, there's actually some sort of real world on the ground critical realities going on here, and that's Pope Francis. It turns out that Pope Francis, Jorge Bergoglio, wanted to write his PhD on Romano Guardini. He finished his tertiary in Cordoba, Spain. Very old-fashioned Orthodox, not Jesuit in the sense that we know from around here, flower girls and felt banners, peace, not that kind of Jesuit. And so he goes to Frankfurt. He's reading through the Guardini papers in Frankfurt. He's preparing himself for his PhD, and then he gets the call. Rome wants you to go back to Buenos Aires to clean up this liberation theology mess. This is not controversial. This is all the Wikipedias on Francis in English. Of course, the German is better and the Spanish is probably better, but it's even there in the English Wikipedia. He gets to Buenos Aires, aborting his PhD plan, and he winds up moving into the Jesuit house, which is, as you know, it's the way they're organized. 2 weeks, he's thrown out. Francis never visits a Jesuit house again from 1992 until he's elected Pope. Rejected, banished. This is Socrates picking the other option. It turns out that that Francis has written a piece of that PhD thesis, which is not well recognized as such. It's chapter 3 of Laudate Si, in which the end of the modern world is footnoted 5 times. In case you had any doubt, this is Francis. This is what he really thinks. This is a PhD he wanted to write about, but wasn't able to. So I encourage all of you Many traditional Catholics, of course, are upset with Francis for a variety of reasons. And amongst them, honestly, is this encyclical. This may be speaking a little bit out of school, but very traditional Latin Mass, Father Pericone, when I brought up Laudate Si to him, he said, don't bother reading that. I said, really? There's nothing in there. Well, sorry, Father, that's wrong. You've got to read it. Particularly, you've got to read chapter 3. In particular, in chapter 3, Francis introduces a phrase which has never been used before by the Catholic Church. Technocratic paradigm. Now, to be fair, Benedict had used the phrases technocratic. It's important that it's not technological, but technocratic. That's to say, ruled by technology. Benedict had used technocratic ideology and technocratic cultural perspective in the English translation of Caritas in Veritate. Makes a lot of sense, as it turns out, because Benedict is also a Guardini guy. This is also what Benedict thinks. This is a radical departure from the way the Church, to this day, officially deals with technology. In particular, Vatican II, a request, a demand was made of the Pontifical Commission on Social Communications to come up with in the spirit of Vatican II, what are we going to do to communicate to the world? That would seem to me to be apologetics in some sense. And 1971, they produced Communio et Progressio, in which, as I quote here, they completely embrace all technologies as gifts of God, and all we have to do is to figure out how to use them. These are no devil here. Don't worry about any of that. And by the way, this continues to this day. So we have fascinating Bishop Ty. You may have met Bishop Ty, an Irish. He wasn't a bishop, but he was sort of the head of communications for the Irish Church. Then got brought to Rome, was made a bishop. He's known as the Twitter bishop. So he's the one who got Francis his Twitter account. Francis, as you might know, has nothing to do with the internet. He communicates via handwritten fax. So amongst his closest associates, as I've been told, I've never met him or asked him this question, the way he communicates is he writes things out, puts it into a fax machine, it comes out of a fax machine. That is scribal. This is the way medieval people communicated, which is quite important in all of this. Next slide, please. So, exactly. I've already given you the outline of this. Peter is a rhetorician and edited my slides by rearranging them. I've now screwed up the order, so I don't know if my rhetoric is being effective. But we're going to republish this, as I say here, and I think we're going to catch some attention. Next slide, please. So these are critical paragraphs or sections of paragraphs out of Laudate Si, chapter 3. I don't need to read them for you. You can peruse them and see what he's saying here, but I hope it is clear to you that no pope has ever spoken this way before. That's what's important here. That is very unusual for those of you who read encyclicals, to pick up an encyclical and say, wow, where did that come from? Now, I'll tell you, in my case, I had a little warning that this was going to happen. So you might remember when Laudate Si was released. You may not remember where you were, as you remember when various people were assassinated or buildings were blown up. But I actually got the initial Spanish release. I don't read or speak Spanish. So I wound up hand translating chunks of this. I was so excited about it. When I got to chapter 3, I fell off my chair. So this, I wouldn't claim to be, I think I've read every encyclical written in the 20th century and read a lot of encyclicals before that, but I wouldn't consider myself to in any way be an expert on encyclicals. And I'm sure I missed a whole lot and don't remember a whole lot. But this ain't business as usual. Next slide, please. Guardini's relationship with popes is a very important thing to keep in mind here. The encyclical Mediator Dei in 1947 by Pius XII is generally regarded to have been inspired, as was in fact Ratzinger's own Spirit of Liturgy by Guardini. It is widely reported, some disputes about exactly what happened and how it was resolved. Offered a cardinal's hat and declined it. He died in 68, and so there's no doubt that there were health issues here. But if you read the literature on Guardini, what you'll see is a lot of commentary about him being melancholic. So think about melancholy as a term in relationship to everything we've been talking about here, in relationship to despairing, of despair, and so forth. Was he despairing, or was he in people's face? I'm going to opt for he was in people's face, and they didn't like it, and so they attribute to him some sort of mental. So we had a marvelous sermon this morning about illnesses, emotional illnesses. So the accusation against Guardini is he's emotionally ill. Pay no attention to what he has to say. We're going to try to address that question. It's important to note here that St. John Paul II was also not a Thomist. He writes a great deal about St. Thomas and the importance of Thomism, to be sure. That's scattered throughout all of his writings. But I tend to think, particularly for Germans who write 2 PhDs, if you've got to probably figure out what this guy thinks by going and reading the PhDs. Peter has been reading Heidegger's PhD, available online. Fascinating stuff. I know when I was interested in Marx, I went and read Marx's PhD. Absolutely fascinating stuff to think where that all turns out. But the connection between Guardini and JP2, if I may be colloquially about this, is the Max Schiller circle, which effectively Guardini was a member of and wrote Die Technik und der Mensch in response to, and that's John Paul's second PhD, which I've not read. Maybe some of you have. I understand he's quite critical of Schiller, quite critical of phenomenology. He's not endorsing this, he's not joining it, but he's observing it because it is enormously important in 20th century Catholic history to understand how this all intersected. When you get to Benedict, however, he was personally in the room as Guardini lectured in Berlin as a 22-year-old student. He repeatedly calls him a great figure. He's very clear that his own Spirit of Liturgy is follow-on and a more imperfect follow-on to Guardini's book with the same name. So he titles it the same. And it's also important to note that he wrote his habilitation, which is a fascinating document, which I have also not read in complete because I don't read German. It turns out that Ratzinger's habilitation was blocked by the Dominicans on his PhD committee. And the first half of it was allowed to be published eventually. And it's on theology of history in Bonaventure. So right back to Guardini and Bonaventure and all of these interesting conflicts. The second half was never allowed to be published. Until 2009, it is now in print in German in the collected works, but I think $75, something like that. Maybe I'll buy a copy. I don't read German, but somebody will tell me what's in the second half of it. But Francis, as I said to you, is really Guardini in the papal throne. Beatification of Guardini was announced in 2016 in Munich, or the process was announced. Next slide, please. So what is to be done here? Benedict option? No. Read Guardini? Yes. Understand the relationship between what Guardini wrote and what the Catholic Church is doing as an organization today? Yes. Understand that. Think that through. It turns out our center is founded on Marshall McLuhan. I gave 2 presentations last year about Marshall McLuhan. Marshall McLuhan is a student ultimately at Gilson. It's all in the same little world here. But McLuhan is different from Etienne Gilson. He's different from Jacques Maritain. He's different from all these people because he did what Guardini did, and they didn't. So what we get from Gilson, of course, is the terror of the year 2000. Instead of understanding what technology is doing to us, instead of understanding why we should be in a third wave of Thomism, he threw his hands up and went, wow, this is really bad. Okay, now let me tell you how bad it is. Okay? There's only one reason why René Girard is of any importance. Yes, interesting to read and so forth, and to put into the context as we have here. The reason why René Girard is important is because he has a billionaire promoting his work, Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel, Thiel, is one of the founders of PayPal and is a billionaire of very considerable geopolitical importance today. And he explains everything that he does in terms of Girard, for whom he was a student and for whom he gave the eulogy at his death at Stanford. I'm departing from the script here a little bit here, but what's going on here? So I've had conversations with a few of you, particularly last night. That was a great opportunity. In the title for this conference is a critical word, reformations, plural. I believe we are currently in another Reformation. I believe the last Reformation occurred in the middle of the 19th century. It is the Reformation for which Nietzsche, whatever else you might think about him, and I've cited him a great deal and probably don't like him any more than most people in the room here, but Nietzsche's statement about the revaluation of all values is a description of a Reformation. We're being reformed, and so therefore our values have to be revalued. And middle of the 19th century, we were revalued. The big one, of course, is the printing press. Before that, the Protestant Reformation. So we've been reformed, and I would suggest that there's many previous Reformations. We're in one now. This one is simultaneously, agreeing with, I think, many of the comments here about Thaddeus' presentation, this is simultaneously the worst and the best. Here's why it's the worst. It is the worst because many people, including Peter Thiel, taking from René Girard, have decided that humanity is so foobarred, to use a technical term, look it up. Humanity is so foobarred, it needs to be replaced by something that is no longer human. So look up transhumanism, look up all the various names for this. We are way into a world where some very rich and very powerful people are trying to design humanity out of history, with Peter Thiel being one of the leaders of that movement. Peter and I are actually working with another leader of that movement. So I'm just to be clear here, what we're doing at the center is not trying to do a Benedict option. We're not trying to circle the wagons. I already told you we've got projects going on in Moscow and Beijing and Tokyo. None of these people are Benedict option people. And now I'm telling you, we got a project with the people who want to eliminate humanity at the center. That's how bad it is. And I'm telling you, the IT invasion of this conference this year, it turns out that there's a massive amount of effort underway now to design every aspect of culture such that humans are not needed. So I will throw a few terms at you. You probably have heard of Bitcoin. You may have heard there's a technology behind Bitcoin called blockchain. You may know that blockchain is not for cryptocurrencies, speculative, silly, multi-$1,000 things in your USB wallet. That's not a blockchain is to build a legal system that does not require humans. They're called smart contracts. If you can express every aspect of what happens in the legal system within the context of this new technology, you don't need humans because the law is. Yeah, exactly.
That sounds like progress.
First, kill the lawyers. That is one of the few Shakespeare lines that I can actually quote. That's right. That's right. So when you hear about humans being replaced in their jobs, that is actually what is not going to happen someday. It's already happened. So imagine a world, which I believe this is the world we're heading into. So I'll ask a question here. We're not doing polling today, but I'll ask a question. What is the percentage of what is called the labor force? This is to say, men and women between 18 and 65 who are able-bodied, the labor force, the United States. What is the percentage of the labor force, the United States, today that has some kind of a job? Not a full-time job, multiple part-time jobs. Any estimates? This is labor of Department of Commerce, standard statistics. No controversy. Yes. Correct. Low 60s is the right answer. In 1970, the numbers were 90% men, 30% women. Then it equilibrated to 60-60. So we're already down 1/3 in terms of men having any form of employment. We're double, as we all know, women having some form of employment. That's called post-industrial knowledge economy, blah, blah, blah. The Martin School at Oxford, the McKinsey Global Institute, probably the two most prestigious organizations that could put millions of dollars to work to go through every single employment category and ask the question, which one of these can be automated, have both come up with the same answer. In the United States economy, half. Half. So we have 60% labor force participation today. Forget about the unemployment rate. What will America look like at 30% of the people actually have jobs? I can tell you that not a single economic model, as used by United Nations, OECD, Defense Department, these are the big modeling people, millions of dollars spent on these things. I can tell you with a high degree of certainty, there isn't a single economic model being used by anybody today for which that is even possible to model. In fact, when I've talked to modelers about this, they say, you can't do that. You allow that to happen, all of our assumptions are out the window, in particular, GDP growth. So all of this stuff about 3% growth under Trump and so forth, and Steve Mnuchin and Goldman Sachs, that ain't gonna happen. We're heading into a situation in which 30% of the people in the United States will actually have some form of a job, and let me suggest to you, GDP will be 1/2 of what it is today. That is a world that no leader in the world today is prepared to even contemplate. And we have another project at the center which will try to model this. That's how bad it is. How good is it? Well, it turns out, And Peter was very helpful all along here. And last year we had Mark Barker here, who is the only human being who really has devoted his life to the interior senses. He did a PhD in Houston at the Thomas Center in Houston. He's now at a seminary outside of New Orleans, another Notre Dame. He's turning his PhD into a series of books. Last year, this conference was the last time he spoke in public. He's told me he's not going to do anything in public. He's no blog post, no nothing until he finishes the book. You can just imagine what his wife is telling him, get this thing over with. It'll be blockbuster for what Peter is doing here. The moral psychology depends on these internal senses. So if cogitative reason, which is shot through in Peter's new book, which is quite remarkable in the way he weaves this all together, we're about to have some remarkable documentation on this. Punchline, all that matters, really, in terms of ultimately how cogitative reason turns out, is the balance between imagination and memory. The two faculties of the soul, powers of the soul, that Aquinas identifies in Book 1, Question 78, Article 4. There is no literature on this topic at all. Thomist psychology has an incredible opening in a world dominated by cognitive psychology, for which this is a black box. We can actually explain to people what this means. Imagine a cogitative reason that's nothing but imagination. Imagine a cogitative reason that's nothing but memory. Imagine various relationships between these complex components. And just to demonstrate for you how this works, of course, is, everybody knows, dreams. So cogitative reason is functioning in our dreams. Our external senses are not working. We can still hear. So yes, Scientology is based upon the fact that we hear everything when we're asleep. We have no earlids. But when you have this detached cogitative reason, you know what you wind up with, because we all dream, and we wake up and go, well, what was that all about? That's what happens when cogitative reason goes awry, but it's worse than that. Imagine cogitative reason which has been forcefully, not for every single individual and not in exactly the same way, but overall society has been driven inexorably towards fantasy. I believe that's what's happened. That describes all the problems that were modernism, postmodernism, and so forth. That's the fantasy world. That's done, gone, finished. The good part of this is every one of us has the Summa Theologica in our pocket. I often say the Library of Alexandria, but the fact of the matter is, anybody who wants to read 178.4 just punches it in his cell phone, and there it is. So, without belaboring this, as a once upon a time computer architect, and there are IT people in the room here, it turns out that computers don't compute. They remember. It turns out the entire internal structure, clocking, instruction codes, actual execution, the ground, if you will, in Gestalt psychological terms, of computing is memory. And the human psychological experience of these memory devices is encouraging us towards a memory version of cogitative reason, away from a fantasy version of cogitative reason. So we are going through a radical psychological transformation for which the printing press and the telegraph, as examples of those previous reformations, never did to us what is being done to us now. So what is to be done? We have a lot of work to do, in which I believe, my final comment here. So mysticism, Benedict option, understandable that we'd be talking about those subjects. Those are obvious subjects we should all be talking about. However, going back to Father Perricone, when you read the Spirit of Liturgy, something will strike you immediately. So ask yourself, where's the mysticism in this? And the answer is, what I found when I started reading Francis, I kept, and I hope you all read Francis, because what you will find over and over again in Francis is reference to the mystical body, not to mysticism. So the contrast that I would offer for you is that in a world in which fantasy, which is to say personal experience, transcendent experience, hallucinogenic drugs, and so forth, dominates, mysticism as an individual experience would be the natural spiritual outcome of that kind of world, the illusionary world. Ever chasing for an experience which is not an illusion, but is really an experience of God. You might know that hallucinogenic drugs, LSD and so forth, originally had the name psychedelic. So that's soul manifesting. That's the original name for this. That's not the current name. The name now is entheogen, God generating. What if, instead of being encouraged to become mystics, that'll never go away, we'll keep on doing that, I'm not arguing against that, I'm just saying, on balance, what if instead of that, we were compelled, for reasons we don't quite understand, to actively participate in the liturgy of the mystical body? What if, in fact, the meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, both of whom, as it turns out, Peter and I were talking about this last night with Juan Pablo, these are both very devout Christians. You don't believe it? Take a look at all the people that Trump surrounded himself with. They're traditional Catholics. Who wrote that speech in Warsaw? The Catholic, Steve Bannon. The day after that, Vladimir Putin gave a lecture to G20 diplomats, which has been not reported in the West, in which he said effectively the same thing. Western civilization is rotten from the inside. And so just imagine what happened in that 2.5-hour meeting between two devout Christians. And just imagine what they said about the Russian Orthodox Church and whatever mishmash is going on over here in relationship to Rome. So my final point is, I believe, because I was being provoked to say this last night at our chat, I believe that Francis is exactly the right pope for this responsibility, to bring the Catholic Church into a position of global leadership in this Reformation. It is not that the Catholic Church has been dramatically strengthened over the course of the past 200 years. It is not. The Catholic Church lost the battle. What has happened instead is that everything else has now become that much incredibly weaker. And in this, the Catholic Church, the mystical body of Christ, the world now depends on it in a way that has not been true since the Protestant Reformation, and in particular, Romano Guardini and Pope Francis, I believe, are critical keys to strengthening that role of the Church. Thank you very much.
Before you respond to that, I wanted to mention something about the Mark's reference, excellent, by the way, Mark.
Thank you, Peter.
To Mark Barker and his work, that John Dealey has a work entitled Semiotic Animal, Postmodern Definition of human being transcending patriarchy and feminism, where he deals extensively with the notion of cogitative reason, particular reason, estimated sense. And it's heavily based upon Mark Barker. Mark Barker. I think Brian probably can help us out later on.
Barker was a student of his.
Well, so is This is the gentleman that only did, he's the only one, I think, that did a PhD, except for healing. And so it's semiotic animal, a subtitle, a postmodern definition of human being transcending patriarchy and feminism.
When did you write that? When did you write that? When did you write that?
2010.
Okay.
So I have a question for Dealey, associate. I ordered a copy. I'm here because of I've known about Peter for years and years, but we never really connected until last year. I said I hear these problems with John, and I sent him an email to respond. Peter, can you help me? Peter said, maybe, but in my comments, he said. And that started this whole thing going. But my question for you is, in the 4 ages of understanding, the Latin age is treated in a somewhat condensed fashion in this still massive work. But there's supposedly a manuscript out there and an almost published book on the Latin age.
Oh, there's a published book, Medieval Philosophy Redefined.
Right, that's recently been published.
That actually came out in 2010. So.
No, this is another one. There is a book listed on Amazon, meant to have been published last year, that has never been published.
Well, there was a second edition of it that was coming out, which I think.
Right.
So that's the second edition of an already published book?
Yes.
That's wonderful, thank you.
Yeah, it's much expanded, what he deals with in the section on the last page. Medieval Philosophy.
Peter? Oh, sorry. Just in conversation, Mark said, imagine a suggested bibliography that would come out of this conference, which is, it would be quite something.
Thaddeus, do you want to respond and then?
Yeah,
Let's get in.
I think a common pattern with both of our presentations is, I mentioned that quote from Szynski about the contingency of our means and being like the Abraham in negotiating new territory and dropping all the customary contrivances and he's walked out. I guess
No, he's going to a better chair so I can film.
Okay.
Well, that was the plan
All
anyway.
right, I'll pause. It's taking a long time to move 20 feet. Let's see. Okay.
No, I can't.
Well, I should wait. I should wait.
Here we go.
Yeah.
The rapture.
Maybe
The rapture.
Oh, here he is.
Oh, there. I was thinking of that chair so we could see you a little bit.
No, no. Here. You weren't telling me to.
Yeah, no, they thought I was talking
When
about.
the magazine Time Out, you may be familiar with, first published in New York City, their first issue was, welcome to New York, now get out.
We thought you had raptured.
Mark, what other contributions or what other parts of Francis' universe do you see Guardini in addition to Laudato Si?
As best I can tell, the topic of Guardini and Francis has been studiously avoided in Rome. It's not a direct answer. You're not going to find it in any straightforward fashion. I think chapter 3 is a piece of the unwritten PhD, effectively. But I have actually had conversations, or rather a colleague of ours has had a direct personal conversation with Bishop Todd. Pretty important guy in all of this. He says nobody's talking about this. Nobody's working on this. And I have many other contacts, some bishops, even some cardinals, and so I think that what I just described to you is just beneath the surface and is ready to break out.
I'll just do a brief response. I don't think I have anything particular to say about the arguments you're making and the conclusions, and although the stay was excellent and very stimulating. But what occurred to me is the way you're thinking is analogous to what I was saying in that quote from Szynski about kind of negotiating new territory and and dropping the customary and cast of mind and ways of thinking and paradigms, you're combining Francis, Guardini, Marshall McLuhan, Benedict, Heidegger, Bonaventure, mystical body of Christ liturgy. These are combinations that, you know, are brilliant and unmade, haven't been made yet. And, you know, somebody like Guardini is interesting, I think. Maybe he's bringing this out of you and me or something, because look how he's being claimed, right? He's being claimed for the precursor of Vatican II. He's claimed, you're claiming him now as an inspiration for both Benedict and Francis. How can that be true? These are people who escape categories because they're true, deep, profound, inspired thinkers. McLuhan is another one. Gerard, Taylor. These are all claimed by different people. They don't fit into the liberal, conservative, orthodox, heterodox, postmodern, modern. You know, they don't fit. They transcend these categories. I think that may overlap with my thesis about mysticism. I think when you're connected to reality in a deep sense, through, we know, sacraments, liturgy, good formation, good habits, good practices, but also just with the kind of disposition, relentless desire to be in contact with reality, of metanoia, as Plato would say, pedagogy, turning around the soul to what's really. You know, we're being called to that because if we don't, the consequences are drastic. The fantasy world that is ubiquitous and is so powerful on us, on our imagination, memory, internal senses. If we can have all the formation of the world intellectually in the old cast, you know, read St. Thomas, and I mean, I think Father Pericone, your anecdote's interesting because I think I know Father Pericone very well, and
I thought you did.
yeah,
That's why I brought him up.
but his response is interesting. I think it shows that he's not quite receptive and amenable to this sort of flexible mishmash, a kind of eclectic putting together of different thinking. It's sort of like, no, on this one angle. You're seeing something there that must be recaptured and recovered. There's a certain inability of him to see that, right? And for all his good, I mean, he's my mentor in many ways in the traditional faith. So I guess I'd say I think there's
Remarkable liturgist.
Of course.
If any of you get a chance to come to 9 o'clock Mass in Jersey City, if you're in New York, I'll pick you up with the fast train.
Well, my point is, he is gifted, holy man, well-formed, Thomas, you know. But what we're talking about here, this new state we're in, this third wave, this
Ragamuffin.
yeah, there needs to be a real courageous willingness to just break the normal customary paradigms of thought, of practice, get outside these boxes. I mean, I like Rene Girard. He's dark, he's apocalyptic. I can see where Peter Thiel would take him in the satanic direction. But then somebody like Taylor, you know, and McIntyre, and they give another perspective on this. And, you know, it seems to me that we have to be willing to, you know, search and mess up our categories and shake them up and suffer this kind of feeling of vertigo sometimes when you convert out of a smaller paradigm, you haven't yet understood the big one. And your talk is just reminds me of that kind of thinking that has to happen and what we all have to be working on. I think it dovetails well with what I'm getting at. And it's a similar conclusion, I think. So I'm really happy to hear it. I don't have anything in particular. I guess I was thinking of Jacques Ellul as well as you were talking. His Technological Society is a very tremendous work on technology, way ahead of its time. And Marshall McLuhan, of course, is important. I found reading Heidegger's essay on technology and then reading especially that last chapter, Man the Machine, in the published work, unbelievably similar, incredibly similar. You know, Heidegger's understanding.
At the same time,
Yeah,
of people from the same
Yeah.
basic place.
yeah. So Heidegger presents in his essay the typical idea of technology. It's an instrument, it's neutral, ontologically, psychologically, in every way, it's culturally. We dominate that instrument, and we use it for our purposes. No, that's technology in the old way. The new technology is a mode of revelation, he calls it, and framing. And with that mode of revelation that the new technology gives us, it has to do with, what does he call it? Stored power?
Standing reserve.
Standing reserve. And because of the new form of consciousness this technology sort of is, we can either see our humanity for what it is and recognize our power and our ability to master the world, and then we can sort of take a step back and be much more aware of the significance of us, or we can just keep up the blindness and really he paints a kind of horrific picture of he indicates what could happen if we don't recognize the power we have in this new mode of consciousness, and very similar to Guardini. The theme of the way in which it's occurred to us that practices and culture and discourse are not neutral towards being, towards our consciousness. They shape us in ways that we almost can't be aware of. And this is Marshall McLuhan's project to make us aware of the meaning of the message. So there's a lot of provocative and just wonderful, paradoxical, and difficult thoughts that you're bringing up in this presentation, and strange combinations of different thinkers and insights and developments and influences. And I don't even know how to assess whether your argument's right or wrong. Why don't we leave with this? Can you give us a one sentence or two sentence statement? What do you see as the essential problem, and however you want to interpret that, and a one or two sentence of the solution. So, can you do that?
Sure.
Put all your paper together with one thing.
Sure. The essential problem is that our internal senses, which are otherwise known as the preconscious, unconscious, subconscious, are formally caused by the habits we form communicating with each other. That's the essential problem. The solution to that problem is a Thomist psychology, which will be an integral component of the third wave Thomism. It will challenge cognitive psychology, which pretends that the human has no soul. So the solution is therefore the title Understanding Media from McLuhan exploded into a full-blown Thomist understanding of the internal senses. And when we go through that, some of us collectively, and I'll try to raise some money and try to put together seminars and so forth. And by the way, I last year suggested we should call this intentional psychology. That may be inappropriate. You will explain to me later on today whether that's a good idea or not. But from these, in particular, if we are successful in, we're in a situation today where nobody pays attention to anybody. Nobody has any credibility. Academia has collapsed. It's a big, giant game that increasingly, day after day, fewer and fewer people want to play. So under those circumstances, what a marvelous opportunity we have. So a few little people get together here in Huntington, a few people get together in Poland. Well, now I'm going to freak myself out by saying, as Margaret Mead said, paraphrased, there's nothing but a small group of people getting together at the right time with the right idea change the world. That's the way it always works. I suspect that we're part of that small group of people who will do that.
Mark,
Bill?
you scare me. And I'll tell you why you're scared.
Lots of people have been telling you, you've been saying the same thing I just said, so that's scary.
That's scary. Parts of your presentation I really agree with this morning, and that scares me. So I'm at the age of 75, and somebody told me yesterday if I drink too much coffee and like the other words of Alzheimer's, and it may be happening, okay? So part of your presentation, I like, and of course, being a Pope Francis guy, thank you. So I want to check some of the records off this. I can use this. We've had deep disagreements on Marshall McLuhan, okay? I knew Marshall McLuhan from the Toronto days, but
You had lunch with him, you told me one day.
yeah.
Gave you advice on your life.
But one of the things he said is not well known. And,
He didn't take the advice.
I want to come back to homelessness. Under mystical, so forth. One of the things McLuhan said, I'm giving about this into the equation. He said, as we get more media, he was media, and he said, the West, because of the effect of the media, will get more to the primitive culture, and the East will get more linear and oral as the reading tradition is there, okay? As I just want a point of truth to that. Well, that means, and that's what explains to me what I see among many people today, this increase in, especially students, Eastern Buddhism, psychology, okay? You know, the younger people don't need what I'm talking about, okay? And this unbelievable surge in pantheism. You know, it's not Gnosticism anymore as much as you talk to young people, it's this pantheistic spirit that they seem to have. And a lot of young people, not a lot, rushing into the Greek Orthodox tradition, okay? I couldn't help but think of that. And I think in Francis, we had Ratzinger there, and Johnny Dimmock down clear and written three philosophers to get into it, okay? But there is a certain, whether you like it or not, unless you're biased, there is an aura, at least in this younger generation, of that mystical image in Francis. So that's why you scare me, Mark. You have a lot of things that were very insightful, and I must think about it.